Hello, welcome to the Classical Music Improvisation channel from the Scroll Ensemble. I'm Robert, and this week I want to talk about a book by Czerny. Now don't turn off the video immediately. I'm not going to talk about millions of scales. I'm going to talk about his book Systematische Anleitung zum Fantasieren, or in other words, Systematic Instruction Manual for Improvisation. In the past, many learning books with details about improvisation existed, and we're planning an entire series on the most interesting ones, to tell you what they are about, what you can learn in them, and how you might get started. Well, first of all, he was a Beethoven student, and most of what we know about Beethoven's approach to improvisation can be found in this book. It's also very to the point and has many examples, so you can kind of immediately dive in and start trying things. Between the lines, meanwhile, we learn about the improvisation culture of the day. Let us know in the comments if there are any specific topics in this book that you would like us to address in more detail in the future. And meanwhile, don't forget to subscribe, and if you like our videos, support us on Patreon. Each chapter in the book is devoted to a specific type of improvisation. The book is organized in such a way that each type of improvisation is a step that naturally leads towards improvising a fantasy on one theme. And after that, we learn to elaborate on that, learning different types of fantasies. Each chapter has a little textual introduction, usually not more than a page, and then a whole load of example pieces in notation. All of these examples have been recorded by Cleodor 2806, link in the description. And finally, Czerny mentions several written compositions that can further inspire the aspiring improviser. In the description you can find playlists with those examples. Before and after these specific chapters, there is an intro and postlude with more general remarks. So in this first part of the video I will talk about those, and in the second about the practical chapters. Czerny defines improvisation as the ability to immediately perform ideas from your mind on your instrument, and then to connect these ideas in such a way that the listener can experience it in the same way they would experience a written piece. So he seems to not want to write that an improvisation should be exactly like a written piece. It's about the experience that is similar to that of listening to a written piece, which is interesting to me. Additionally, a bit later he writes that improvisation should have a clear form, but that its form is still much freer than in a written composition. So Czerny later states that written compositions are like an honorable architectural building in which symmetry is key. A successful fantasy is like a beautiful English garden, seemingly ruleless, but full of surprising changes, yet executed in an organized and understandable way. And he goes further to say that in improvisation there can be a freedom, an ease of connecting ideas, which cannot be sensed by the audience even when someone is playing written fantasies inspired by this improvisation. So apparently witnessing the act of improvising by a good improviser is a unique experience. This experiential aspect is also important for the performer. In many parts of the book, the final judge of whether your improvisation is successful or whether it could be longer or not is the audience. Are they bored or are they still with you? Czerny says you could improvise on any instrument, but the piano is the best. For clavier virtuosen, it is even mandatory to improvise. Quiz! I also added a little quiz in this video. First question. What does Czerny think you need to be a good improviser, and what do you think for that matter? Czerny finishes his book by saying that it's unique. We can look at that in different ways. It's true that compared to his contemporaries, this book goes into greater detail, has many examples, and talks about all different forms of improvisation that are current, rather than most books, for example, focusing mainly on the art of preluding. However, books like this, devoted solely and comprehensively to improvisation practice existed in the past, like Santa Maria's Arte de Tanier Fantasia in the 15th century or Nied's Musikalische Anleitung in the 18th century. And you can find all of those in our Improvisation Resources database. Showing improvisation with an introductory text and then a host of examples has also been done for centuries. Furthermore, Czerny discusses improvisation types that have existed and been discussed for centuries. So, variations, fugue, fantasy, these are all genres or types that are not new. Perhaps the only new type of improvisation is the potpourri, about which he writes that it recently became a favorite with audiences. Starting from preludes and cadenzas, we arrive at the first type of fantasy, using one theme. Then he continues to fantasies on several themes, potpourri and then variations. And he does say that variation is part of all composing, so I'm a bit surprised that he only adds it now and not before the chapters on fantasies. After the variations, he goes on with imitative styles, fugue and canon, to arrive at the freest of fantasies, the capriccios. The first two chapters are devoted to preludes. Chapter 1 is about shorter preludes and chapter 2 about longer preludes, or, well, he calls them introductions. The first type is very short. It could even just be 2 chords. Like many authors before, Czerny describes the aim of the prelude, to try the instrument, warm up the fingers, and awaken the attention of the listener. Interestingly, Czerny says that if you're accompanying someone else on the piano, the soloist, you can still do a prelude on the piano. Just keep it short. However, if you're playing a concerto introduced by the orchestra, don't prelude. Czerny basically says, take a few chords as a basis, as a skeleton. By elaborating them with some rhythms, passages and runs, you can make many different pieces. In this video, I'll take you on a short journey to get started, even if you don't know any chords. So, some practice advice. Take these examples in his book, and the many that are published in other collections, and transpose them, play them in different keys. Now, find the original skeleton of the prelude and add different runs and passages. Exchange them again for other runs and passages. Every time you practice a written piece, start your practice with a few small preludes, inspired by that piece you will practice. Inspiration can come from a motive or the character of the piece. You'll warm up your fingers and immediately actually also secretly practice that piece. Surprisingly, he adds you can start in another key as well than the original piece, and add all kinds of modulations and surprising chords, as long as you end in the tonality of the next piece. He then gives many examples of these modulations and surprising harmonic relations, which will help for later journeys in improvising fantasies as well. The longer preludes are like an introduction. They could be used for solo pieces that don't have an officially composed introduction already, and directly start with a theme, for example a rondo or a variation piece. More serious works, like Beethoven's F minor Sonata Opus 57, should not have a prelude. The longer prelude works in much the same way as the simpler prelude. You can use hints of motives of the coming piece, but not actually entire themes, because that would ruin the actual piece. Alternate more singing phrases with passage work, and feel free to start it in a different meter from the actual piece, which also seems quite crazy to me. It should end on the dominant chord of the next piece and then jump right into it by way of a cadenza. And then he mentions an older type of prelude without any sense of meter, almost recit-like, unconscious, as if walking in completely unknown surroundings, he says. What was this type of prelude called in the Baroque period? We all know of the cadenza just before the end of the last solo of the soloist in a concerto. But first, Czerny talks about a type of cadenza on other fermatas, or on bridges back into the theme, or from one idea to the next, and other places where the music seems to stop for a bit. Czerny then mentions that knowing how to do this will help to improvisatorily knit together the ideas in fantasias. In variation pieces, you could add quite a few of these. Again, whereas in serious pieces, no cadenzas. He mentions Beethoven's Op. 29 Sonata as an example of this serious kind of music. For these small cadenzas, he gives the following rules. Cadenzas should fit with the rest of the piece. Cadenza should not be too long and rhapsodic. Don't stop the flow of the piece. Don't change the harmony, especially no strange other chords allowed. Make a good bridge to the next passage, often with a diminuendo or rallentando. But if the next entry is fast, it can also happen with a crescendo and accelerando. And then, of course, he gives many examples, which again should be practiced in many different tonalities. Finally, he concludes with the Concerto cadenza, which has its own special form of fantasizing. It can be long, and you're allowed all kinds of modulations here. All the most interesting ideas of the concerto, and also its most brilliant passages, should be used. He even says the artist can show his heart even more in the cadenza than in the concerto itself. His final example of this is almost 7 pages long, so yeah. Now we enter the realm of fantasizing. He says fantasizing is almost unconscious, dreamlike playing. Don't think about every note. Yet, the next phrase already says, especially with improvisation on one theme, we must remain close to that theme. So, actually strangely, he admits that this is the hardest form of fantasizing because you have to keep attention. So why is it the first one we learn? Finding a theme is not difficult. Czerny says you could even use 2 random notes. The simpler the theme, the more can be done with it. Any theme could be developed, but this must be practiced regularly. This development is done by taking our theme and changing its meter and rhythm to attain many different starting points for different pieces of music, and then we try to develop that, of course. He then mentions many compositional forms, which we can partly learn from his examples, but also from written contemporary music, which he mentions. So here it is interesting that we sort of enter the realm of the composer. We need the same knowledge and ability, we just need to be able to do it in the moment. So first, he says, practice these different types and forms separately, and then you'll be able to combine them in surprising ways into your final fantastical product. On our website you can find Hummel's descriptions of all these forms and links to recordings, so this might be a way in for us. Let us know if you want us to do videos about these compositional forms we mentioned and how to get started on improvising them. He also gives an extra hint. If the audience gives you a very long theme, then it's best to select only part of it and develop only that. Quiz time! Which part of this theme do you think Czerny advises us to take? The approach here is similar to the monothematic fantasy I just discussed. It's easier though, he says, because with one theme one might end up repeating the theme too much and boring the audience. Here our audience is back again. Even with more themes, the first theme is the main theme of the fantasia, which should be heard most and come back at the end. Importantly, the other themes should be related to the first. If they are too different, we get into a different type of fantasy, like the potpourri or the capriccio. Czerny says that perhaps no form is more adept at expressing the inner life and aesthetic being of the artist than this multi-themed fantasy. Here Czerny suddenly discusses a psychological aspect of improvisation, which I don't think seen before in these kind of historical books. Normally, fantasias would be performed in closed gatherings, or at home, for a few people maybe, but sometimes the pianist must perform in a theater. And then he says the piano player might get nervous with the bigger amount of people, and this might stop the creative flow. For this kind of situation, he says, a potpourri is much better. You basically string together different famous melodies from operas, songs, folk songs, etc. And people love the melodies, they know them, they're impressed with you that you can combine them, and with some glittery passages you will definitely impress them. Here the themes should be as different to each other as possible, both in meter, tempo and character, so this is different from the multi-themed fantasy from before. Pay attention to the audience to know when you need to change themes. On a more artistic level, you can also use the fact that the audience knows the text of these songs. By combining them in new ways, you recontextualize the meaning of the texts. Besides having to know a lot of songs, the knowledge from previous chapters is enough to improvise a potpourri. Final quiz question. What makes a good theme or melody for variation? Czerny mentions different methods to vary a piece, many of which we've already seen in the discussion of fantasies before. So of course he says you can add different passages and figures in triplets, sextuplets, etc. Both hands could do that together or separately, but the melody, or at least the harmonic progression, should remain clear in one of these voices. You could add all kinds of trills and ornaments, cantabile variations, either on the bass, or you could actually make a new melody. Then he mentions the gebundene Stil. The melody remains clear, but in other voices the harmony is enriched a lot, especially in a sort of slow movement with a lot of chromatic notes, kind of like sliding around the melody. Imitation, like a canon or a fugue. Changing the tempo, meter, key, and thereby creating an adagio or a polonaise, a waltz or a rondo. Most variation sets have a finale, which can be freer and let go more of the original melody or harmony. In a potpourri, only use 2 to 3 variations max, because otherwise you're staying with one theme for too long and the audience will get bored. Otherwise, variations can be as long as you want, as long as the audience is interested. Keep changing between brilliant and vivacious variations and soft and serious ones. The longer, the more shiny figuration will be necessary, and then accordingly the finale should be longer and more interesting. This is the least impressive chapter. Basically, Czerny gives us an example of 3 types and leaves us with the idea that knowing counterpoint and learning from the old masters is the road to success. The capriccio is the final and freest type of fantasy. An arbitrary stringing together of your own ideas without especially developing any of them. So this lack of development and relation between elements is what makes this genre stand out from the others. Czerny mentions the usefulness of originality, humor, and spicy and even Baroque ideas. And Baroque used to mean oddly shaped pearl, so although Baroque style as an idea started to be used for what we call the Baroque style now, already in the 19th century, probably Czerny rather meant the first meaning. Czerny does mention that most written pieces called capriccio by other composers do not follow this idea, and so far this is also my experience. A capriccio is more like an etude or a fantasy. Czerny's example is pretty wacko. At the very end, Czerny does concede that even in this very freest of forms, a completely formless end is not fitting. So some kind of rallentando development could be used to end the piece clearly, and maybe with a few elements that are, well, that give it some kind of shape. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Let us know your thoughts and comments below, and you can help us a lot by subscribing and even more by supporting us on Patreon.